Young couple inherits old mansion. Their Rottweiler leads them to a locked trapdoor. Rain came sideways off the Atlantic, needling the windshield as Lila Carter and Noah Reed crawled along the cliff road into Port Clyde. The GPS died, the radio hissed, and Titan, normally silent, let out a low, steady growl that vibrated through the seats. When the mansion finally appeared between leaning pines, its widow's walk seemed to lean back, as if the house had overheard their names long before they arrived. The key Margaret mailed felt colder than the rain. Inside, the air held salt, oil, and something faintly metallic, like pennies on the tongue. A clock on the hall table ticked without hand. On the wall, a portrait faced backward, a corner of canvas torn just enough to reveal a sliver of eye staring from the wrong side. Noah reached to turn it. The clock stopped dead. Titan stiffened, nose cutting the air, shoulders locked, stare angled up the stairwell. "Quick look, then town," Noah said, trying for practical and getting only thin. Lila touched the banister, dust smeared like ash across her palm. She swallowed Margaret's name. The storm made a long, hollow sound through the chimney, a throat clearing before word. Titan launched up the stairs, claws clicking, breath hot, intent absolute. The second floor smelled of old turpentine and damp linen. A door stood swollen in its frame, paint blistered like scale. Lila passed a row of nailed-shut windows between the boards. A single strand of red thread fluttered as if tugged from the other side. Far below, a wave hit rock hard enough to shake plaster dust from the ceiling like powder snow. The attic hatch gaped open on rusted hinges. Titan shoved through, then froze, head canted, listening to something Lila couldn't hear. She stepped in after him. Cold air rose through the floor. Titan's paw struck a seam wood that didn't sound like wood. He raked again. Hollow, locked. From beneath, a soft draft carried a scent of linseed and seaweed and a whisper of fresh lavender, impossible in this cold, dead house. The trapdoor shivered under Titan's weight, as if something below had shifted closer to meet them. What happened next will shock you. In Boston, Lila Carter woke before dawn to the hiss of the radiator and thin light that never reached the back wall of their two-room apartment. She lay still, listening to the city below, buses sighing, a siren fading. On the nightstand, bills leaned like a crooked tower. Noah Reed had circled a due date in black ink and drawn a box he hoped to check. Beside the bills sat a heavy old key the lawyer had mailed with a letter that used words like bequest and remainder. Lila read the letter twice and pressed her thumb to the key as if it might carry her aunt's heat. Noah brewed coffee in a dented pot from a yard sale. He kept the noise low. Titan padded across the narrow kitchen and pressed his head to Lila's knee. She scratched his cheek, grateful for the warm weight. "We should go see it," Noah said. "At least know what we're facing." Lila nodded. Margaret had been more fact than presence, a postcard with a painted storm and 3 dry words on the back. Life in Boston had narrowed. Noah worked part-time at a hardware store and fixed heaters and lamps for cash. Lila took contract shifts at a small gallery that paid late and taught 2 night classes. Every month they did math at the kitchen table. Rent rose, groceries crept higher, and a dental bill sat like a stone. They cut subscriptions, sold old textbooks, and skipped nights out. Grief refused rules. After the funeral, Lila reached for her phone at lunch, composing messages she would not send. Margaret lived alone and painted. She mailed small gifts wrapped in brown paper. The last time Lila saw her, a black scarf hid most of her hair. She pressed a folded card into Lila's hand and said, "I am proud of you." Lila stored the card and told herself there would be time. 3 weeks after the funeral, the lawyer called. The will named Lila heir to a property in Port Clyde, Maine, with contents and a small account for taxes. He urged a visit before winter and said the studio might hold work of value. Lila pictured her aunt at a window over a slate sea. Noah said they should go, count repairs, list the place if needed, and stop the drain of worry before it soaked everything. They left on a Friday. The city slipped behind in a smear of brick and neon. Titan dozed on a blanket in the back, waking when the highway crossed water. Noah drove while Lila traced routes. Beyond the state line, lanes narrowed and pines pressed close. A clerk at a roadside store admired Titan and warned them about black ice. Where the coastal wind cut the road, the sky lowered until the edges of the world looked rubbed out. Port Clyde arrived after a last bend that opened to water. The town sat snug against a harbor pricked with mast lights. Lila watched a boy run along the pier with a dog and felt her throat tighten. They passed a white church with a bell that ticked in the wind. The mansion stood on a rise beyond the last street lamp, behind spruce that swayed under gusts. In gentle light it might have looked romantic. At dusk the house resembled a retired ship. Clapboard peeled. A scar ran down the east wall where a porch had collapsed. The widow's walk tilted like a hat after a hard night. The iron on the steps felt cold through Lila's glove. Noah parked by a lichen-rimmed well and shut off the engine. Titan broke the silence with a soft chuff that sounded like a question. Inside the air dropped. The hall smelled of rope and dust. Each step raised a faint cloud that caught the little light that came through the seams. The interior felt like a tomb of memory. The parlor held a sofa under yellowed muslin. The dining table was ringed with marks as if hot cups had been set down by someone who no longer guarded the finish. In the kitchen a coil burner sat rusted in its cradle. A calendar showed a march from years past. Margaret's distance had been the fixed weather of Lila's childhood. Her mother spoke of her sister with fondness and a restraint that suggested old arguments. A package once arrived with sketchbooks and pencils. Lila drew a horizon line that did not end. She left for school on a scholarship that appeared when a loan officer used the word impossible. Noah walked the rooms with a flashlight and a pad, making lists. Roof, windows, boiler, stairs. He counted outlets, checked a breaker and crouched to look at a cracked pipe. He said they could sell it as is to a buyer with capital and a stomach for an old frame. The season would close soon. They should not get attached to boards and stories that could not pay their way. Lila heard him, and did not argue. She moved through corners hung with cobweb flags. A stack of canvases stood turned to the wall. She ran her thumb over a jar where bristles had turned to stone, and pictured Margaret rising early to catch a cloud edge, or mixing color until a blend matched a feeling. A small room at the back held a window facing the sea. Foam broke on rock and a gull lifted into the wind. Wings, steady like a decision. Titan paced. His posture made every muscle look ready. He sniffed baseboards, door jambs, and the hollow beneath the stairs, pausing with one paw lifted. He was not fidgeting, his attention formed a chain. He took them to the stairwell and sat with his chest square and ears forward. He looked up. Lila felt the skin at the back of her neck tighten. Not from fear alone, but from recognition. The house wanted them to listen. Noah followed the dog's gaze and wrote one more note. They agreed to sleep at the inn and return in the morning with gloves and better light. Noah locked up, then unlocked to check a window, then locked once more. On the porch, wind pushed sea spray that dried to salt on Lila's lips. She tasted it and thought about the years since she had stood near her aunt. She clipped Titan's leash, though he did not pull. He walked at her side as if the path had always been his work. At the inn the clerk handed them a key and a hand-drawn map. They ate soup near a humming heater. Back in the room, Lila lay awake, listening to Titan's breathing and the slow tick of pipes. She saw the house in her mind, the window that faced dark water, the frozen calendar, the stairs that turned out of sight. The pull she had felt since the lawyer's call held firm. Worry, longing, duty braided tight. Morning would send them back to the rise above the harbor, back to rooms that kept their breath. Titan would lead, Noah would measure, and she would try to read what her aunt left unsaid, one quiet space at a time. Tonight, morning came flat and gray over Port Clyde, the harbor a slate bruise under dragging cloud. Noah parked by the mossed well and killed the engine. Titan jumped down, shook once, and lowered his head as if tasting the cold. Lila zipped her jacket, pulled on gloves and slipped the iron key into her pocket. Quick sweep, then we plan, Noah said, lifting a toolbox and bags. She nodded, though the house on the rise felt like a sentence paused mid-breath. The lock fought, then yielded with a rope-on-stone scrape. Inside the air smelled of salt, linseed and iron. Their breath fogged and vanished. Dust turned into a thin shaft from the transom. When the wind leaned against the door, particles drifted as though the house exhaled. Lila ran a flashlight along the wainscoting and found hairline cracks and a fingertip smudge at shoulder height, as if someone had paused there long ago to listen. They began in the front parlor, a muslin-draped sofa hunched beneath a tarnished mirror. Lila lifted the cloth and found the brocade gone brittle, springs slumped into a sad trough. Canvases leaned along the baseboard like books. She turned one and faced a storm, iron water, a narrow seam of break, horizon bruised into pearl. No signature, only a small M ghosted in the corner. The next held the lighthouse under a pewter sky. She set them upright to air, each image releasing a breath the room had saved. Noah moved with the practiced economy of a man who had rescued failing apartments for owners who preferred paint to repair. He plugged a tester into outlets and marked plates with blue tape when no light appeared. He peered into a return vent where a bird had built a nest from thread and hair, sealed it with tape and a note, and lifted a corner of the rug to find a tiled star cracked through its center yet stubbornly handsome. Salvageable feature, he said. Wirings off. Titan paced the baseboards like a surveyor drawing a precise map. He inhaled at seams, paused at corners, leaned into shadows with patience sharpened by purpose. When Lila moved a stack of sketchbooks from a trunk to the table, he pressed his muzzle near the latch and breathed, then huffed, dissatisfied. She opened the top book, hands filled the first page, knuckles shaded with tenderness and control. The next held wave studies, arrows for wind and notes about light solving distance. Margins carried grocery lists, paint names and tides. They worked the room in a slow circle. Lila stacked brushes, cemented with old medium, found jars labeled with dates, and shook a tin that answered with a small clatter of pennies. She tried to picture her aunt bent over a canvas, shoulders set against weather and silent. That image came more easily than the memory of a voice at any holiday table. The dining room wore a drift of plaster dust. Pale rings dotted the long table where cups had once lived. One chair faced the window, seat pushed back an inch as if its sitter had risen to answer the seat. A sideboard drawer yielded a photograph in an envelope. Margaret stood on a boulder, coat open, chin tipped toward the wind, eyes bright. No companion crowded the frame. On the back a date and the word "still" written twice, the first mark scratched out, the second darker, decisive. Lila pressed the card with her thumb until the paper warmed. Upstairs the wallpaper looked floral at a distance and like bruises when you stood close. The first bedroom held a narrow bed, a small desk and a trunk that groaned when Lila raised the lid. A folded sweater released seat. A red scarf shed a single thread that clung to her glove. A shoebox contained fragments, ticket stubs, a brass button and a pebble with a white stripe. At the desk a shallow drawer stuck. She worked it free and found a winter postcard of the harbor, edges softened by handling, addressed to no one. Noah measured sashes and wrote numbers, jaw set around practical math. "We can't heat this without gutting half the bones," he said. The sentence was correct and cruel. Lila angled the photograph to the gray light and hunted Margaret's expression for a clue that might excuse distance. The image held its own counsel. She slid it into her pocket and heard the paper rasp her coat like a small breath. Titan whined, a taut note that demanded attention. He stood at the hall's end, body aligned with the narrow back staircase, ears pushed forward, eyes carried a certainty only a working dog can manufacture. He looked at Lila, looked at the steps, then back again, a request folded as a command. The back stairs curled tight, meant for trunks rather than guests. Halfway up the smell changed. Linseed, varnish, cold metal and a thin ribbon of lavender that felt impossible in a house so long sealed. The attic opened under a filmed skylight. Boxes labeled tacks, rags frames stood along the joists. A dented kettle sat by a stool. Canvas stretchers leaned like ribs against rafters. Dust hung thick enough to make the flashlight into a visible blade. Titan stopped near the left rafters, pressed a paw to the boards and scratched twice. The sound that rose was not a dull thud but a drumhead note with air beneath. Lila crouched, laid a palm on the plank and felt cold climb her glove. Noah knelt, rapped his knuckles along the seam, and heard the note lift. "Hatch," he said, inside an attic. He tugged the ring set flush in the board. It refused. Lila tried. Resistance felt like a held breath. "Locked," she said. Titan rested his head against her shoulder as if to say yes here. She steadied her hands. They searched for a key. Boxes surrendered thread spools, brittle brushes, blank tags and a cracked palette. Under twine in a shallow crate lay another photograph. Margaret on the widow's walk, one hand on the rail, jaw set, eyes narrowed into the sun. The angle suggested a timer and a short run into the frame. Triumph and loneliness shared the print. Lila tucked it beside the first and lifted a lid labeled frames. Nothing there but nails and corner braces. She pressed her ear to the boards and heard a faint draft whisper through. Noah slid a pry bar under the seam and stopped after the first groan, unwilling to split wood without understanding the structure. Right tool, he said, or a locksmith. He traced distances with the light and marked joists in his notebook. Titan settled on his belly, chin between paws, eyes fixed on the ring, a guard posted at a gate. Wind shouldered the glass until the hinge clacked in a steady rhythm. A shutter banged below, then fell quiet. The house kept a language of knocks and breaths that would continue whether anyone listened. Lila pressed her palm to the plank again and imagined a lung beneath, waiting to fill. They went down to search with a new focus. Every drawer became suspect, every frame a possible hide. In the study a false back concealed the ledgers. In the pantry a jar labeled salt hid nails. The kitchen offered a tea tin full of screws. At the base of the back stairs, Titan stood with stillness that read as reverence. He had stopped whining. He watched them with patience that was not passive. He believed they would listen. Lila touched his collar and felt warmth under the leather. Thoughts she usually silenced rose before she could push them down. Calls she had not returned. The last letter she had opened and folded away. The way she had prioritized noise over quiet signals because noise looked like proof. If you have ever muted the tug in your chest because it felt inconvenient, she thought, consider the moment before evidence arrives, and remember which part of you tried to speak first. Dusk entered without announcing news. They ate crackers from Noah's pocket, drank water from the jug and climbed once more. The attic met them with a cleaner cold as if air seeped from the hollow below. Noah aimed the beam along the seam again. A thin glint appeared beside the ring, the stitched outline of a keyhole swallowed by paint. Lila smiled despite the chill. The puzzle had admitted it existed. She tried the small keys on Margaret's ring from the desk, each one turning hope a notch, each one stopping shy of truth. Tomorrow, Noah said, pocketing the keys. Titan's tail thumped once. He lowered his head to his paws and kept his eyes on the ring. Guard on duty, shift not over. The wind pressed another long knock against the eaves, patient and measured, like a teacher waiting for the room to fall quiet so the next lesson could begin. Titan's paw scraped the attic boards in a steady rhythm that made the floor thrum like a muted drum. He had claimed a rectangle of planks near the left rafters, where seams formed a shape just wide enough for a person to slip through. Each rake ended in a hollow note that did not belong to solid framing. Lila pressed her ear to the wood and felt a cold draft breathe through the grain. The sound carried a distance, the way a shell keeps the ocean after you leave the shore. Noah knelt beside her and tapped two knuckles along the seam until the tone rose like a small bell hidden inside the house. A ring sat flush with the plank, iron filmed in rust, paint drifted over its lip like dried surf. Beside it, almost invisible, a thin keyhole hid beneath a seam of brush strokes. Someone had disguised the door with care. Lila brushed the line with a gloved finger and felt the groove's clean edge. She whispered that Margaret did not want it seen, and the thought arrived with the weight of a fact. Wind dragged a sleeve of rain across the skylight. A shutter downstairs banged twice and then clamped shut. Noah tried the ring. It refused, tight as a fist. Titan set his paw on the iron and glanced up, a patient command in his eyes. Lila looked along the rafters for a toolbox, a hook, a nail where a key might wait. Boxes offered twine, brittle brushes, a tin of screws and receipts bundled with string. The attic had the order of someone who cleaned when work ended and left before putting the last thing away. "We need tools," Noah said, and aimed his light at the seam to pencil the outline and map pressure points. Titan whined once, sharp and urgent, then fell silent as if saving breath for the moment the door yielded. They went down. The stairs crackled like brittle paper. The study gave a small hammer wrapped in linen, a chisel with a smooth bite, and a brass key lying in a saucer as if it had been set there mid-thought. Lila held the key up to the window, its bow wore down on one side. She pictured a hand turning it in the same half-circle many times and wondered whether that hand had been nervous or calm. In the kitchen they found a pry bar tucked behind rags, the metal nicked from years of stubborn lids and warped frame. Back in the attic, rain turned to pellets that rattled the glass. The day dimmed until dust looked like smoke in Noah's beam. Titan rose to greet them and returned to his station, chest square, ears tilted forward. Lila scraped paint from the keyhole with the chisel tip. Flakes fell and skittered like fish scales. Under the crust the mouth showed itself irregular but ready for metal. She slid the key in. It resisted with a polite refusal. She rotated the bow a quarter turn and tried again. The lock admitted that something moved inside and then denied her the rest. Noah took the key and tried to apply gentle pressure. The result matched hers, permission followed by refusal. Frozen, he said, or the wrong cut. He set the key aside and examined the frame. Concealed hinges. Whoever built this expected prying. He wedged the chisel under the lip and leaned in tiny increments, listening to the wood answer with creaks that sounded like old grammar. No, maybe, not there. Try again. Lila worked the opposite side, spreading effort so the tongue would not snap. Wind found a seam in the roof and sang through it with a thin metallic hum. Somewhere below, a loose portrait tapped against the wall. The house's small noises gathered into a language she could almost understand. She thought of Margaret painting by this same light, lifting canvases to catch a change in the sky. Had her aunt knelt right here and turned this same ring? If so, what sat below that deserved a door this careful? A studio, a cache of letters. Proof that silence had been protection rather than indifference. Titan lay with his chin on his paws, eyes fixed on the ring. When their progress stalled, he touched the iron with his muzzle, as if lending breath to metal. Lila smiled despite the cold and told him they heard. The last bridge of paint let go with a tired sigh. A hairline gap appeared along the seam, enough to send up a thread of colder air. Varnish and salt braided with something faint and clean that reminded Lila of the red scarf upstairs. Noah slid the chisel deeper and met the lap. He shifted the angle to protect the tongue, then pressed with patience. A click traveled up the tool and into Lila's wrist like a live wire. The ring budged. She pulled. The slab rose a finger's width and stuck as if a palm pressed back from below. Wait on it, Noah said. He lowered the board and peered into the slot. Dust fogged. He coughed and waved it aside. Lila lay flat, closed one eye and aimed the light into the slim world beyond. A narrow stair fell away, steep and painted in dark enamel, edges scuffed by careful feet. To the right a crate crowded the first tread, lid split along a seam. The blocked step had stopped the door from rising more than that inch. They braced their hands on the ring and lifted together while Noah hooked the pry bar's claw around the crate's corner. He levered and grunted. Wood rasped across wood, a slow, stubborn sound that felt like moving time. Again, he said. They lowered, reset, and pulled. The crate shifted another inch. Titan rose and pressed his shoulder against Lila's leg as if lending force through contact. Again, the third pull dragged the crate clear of the line. Noah slid a short board between the slab and the joist to hold the door. Cold poured out like water from a stone cistern. The scent of linseed oil stepped forward, followed by charcoal and salt, and then a softer thread, lavender, impossible yet undeniable. Lila angled the light, and saw the stair disappear into an angle of shadow that looked crafted rather than accidental. Noah set his palm on the first tread and pushed. It held with the steady pride of old work. They looked at each other across the opening, faces dusted white to the eyebrows, breaths close enough to show. We could stop, Noah said. He was not teasing. He was balancing safety with sudden awe. Get a pro, come back with proper support. We will not sleep if we stop, Lila answered. Her voice felt calm to her ear, the calm that follows the moment you accept the cost of knowing. Not after hearing this door asked to be opened. He nodded once, slow, then. He tested the second tread. It creaked but did not protest. Titan stood at the edge, tail low, stance ready, eyes bright with a certainty that had no appetite for applause. Stay, Noah said. The dog sat, quivering with contained purpose. Wait. Siren wash pulsed across wet maples as Officer Daniel Reed braked at the field's edge. Rain stitched the grass into dark seams. Eleanor waited at the fence with a blanket over her shoulders, hair slicked, eyes fierce. Clara leaned on the gatepost with a poise so smooth it felt staged. At Reed's heel, Zeus quivered, head low, breath in short huffs, focus pinned to the tree line where fog smudged the world. Show me, Reed said. Eleanor pointed toward a rise where an old stump squatted beside a split granite slab. He kept dragging me there, she said. Clara's mouth lifted, then flattened. Reed released the lead. Zeus moved like a tool, no wasted step, nose cutting rein, tail a metronome of intent. He quartered the slope, sampled the wind, then arrowed to the stump and planted both paws, claws scraping bark. A whine. Reed tapped the wood. The reply rose hollow, not beam solid but chamber thin. Zeus dropped a dig, flinging wet loam. The tone steadied. Alive, Reed said, already keying the radio for forensics, rescue and a medic. Eleanor wrapped the blanket tighter and went still. Clara adjusted her collar with fussy precision and watched as if from behind glass. Floodlights arrived under a snapping canopy. Tech supervisor Maya Ortiz crouched by the stump. Consistent thumps, she said, ear close. She brushed back needles and found a groove in the soil leading toward the slab. She teased a length of plastic from the trench, clear tubing disguised under pine duff, its open end buried beneath stone. Airway, she said. Deliberate. Rain intensified, turning the trench to soup. Zeus held a downstay with effort, nails biting mud, eyes fixed to earth. Reed scratched his ear. Good boy. Hold. Ortiz tracked the tube to a junction, then snaked a fiber camera into the line. The monitor bloomed. Splintered wood, a curve of shoulder darkness. Occupied, she said. Curled left. Ceiling maybe 18 inches. Keep talking, Reed said, pitching his voice to the ground. We hear you. Breathe slow. Eleanor echoed him, voice steadier with each phrase. Hold on. We're here. Clara hovered outside the canopy, shoes oddly clean, gaze avoiding the tube. Fire rolled, tools from the engine, jacks, cribbing. A low whine of hydraulics. Reed shoveled beside Ortiz to widen the cut. Under the stump they hit plywood scored with hatch marks. A concealed ring refused to budge, screws held like teeth. He knocked again. The thump below answered, weaker but precise. Not random, Ortiz said. Counting us. They cut a relieving trench along the slab's edge, slid wedges and exposed a recess with a padlock hidden under soil. The shank was black with rust yet slick with recent oil. This wasn't a panic burial, Ortiz said. Engineered, timed. Reed looked at Clara, who met him with polished blankness. Zeus lifted his head and whined twice, nose angling toward leaf litter by the granite. Reed parted the mat and found a second tube, narrower, capped and drilled with pinholes. Bleach clung to it, a packet of protein bars. A sealed bottle of water and duct tape wrapped in plastic lay shallow nearby. Eleanor's jaw set. Someone expected to keep a person here, she said, long enough to need rations. Ortiz fed oxygen down the primary tube and watched the gauge settle. Flow, she said. She slid the camera again and spoke to whoever lay below. Light coming soon. Protect your eyes. A hand flexed against tape. The winch took weight. Crib, lift. Crib again, every motion called out so nothing shifted wrong. Rain hammered the canopy, mud swallowed Reed's boots. Eleanor placed her palm on Zeus's back and left it there. Clara checked her phone, turned the screen face down and resumed her museum stay. The lock surrendered to a slim saw, the blade whispering through soft metal. It dropped with a sound far too small for what it freed. Screws shrieked as they backed out of wet plywood. Cold rose from below like breath from stone. The medic slid beside Reed, mask and bag ready. Ortiz lowered the stethoscope mic. Heartbeat, faint. Talk to me, Reed said, unsure if the trapped heard words or only cadence. Eleanor leaned near the rim. You're not alone, she said. We're lifting. The rhythm under the wood steadied with her. Clara smiled again, small and crisp. They levered the slab a quarter-inch at a time. Beneath, pegged timbers appeared, braced like a crude vault. Tape on wrists. Ortiz said, wiping rain from the monitor. Constriction marks, hypothermic. She nodded to the medic. Airway good, oxygen taking. Zeus crept one pace closer on his belly, eyes flicking to Reed for permission. Easy, Reed said, thumb stroking the collar. The dog stilled, vibrating. If you have ever uncovered a family secret you didn't want to face, remember the instant truth pushes through doubt. Rain, tools, a dog refusing to leave, a heartbeat insisting on witnesses. They cracked the last screws and folded the plywood back. A face blinked at light, gray with cold, lashes wet, tape hugged his mouth. The medic cut the bindings, sealed the mask and squeezed the bag. Chest rose, trembled, settled. The first full inhale sounded loud against the rain. Eleanor sagged, then straightened, hands still on Zeus. "You're safe," she told the man. Zeus's tail thumped once. Clara stood rigid, calm, so complete it felt like an absence. They lifted the survivor out, hands braced, each shift called clear. The gurney took him, blankets wrapped tight, heater humming. The medic shouted a core temp and a plan. Reed logged times, positions and tool placements. He studied the stump's mouth, the airway, the oiled lock and the staged rations. Every detail said rehearsal. Ortiz sealed the tubes in bags, photographed trenches and cast tool marks where soil still held edges. "We'll get prints off the cap," she said. "Maybe transfer the screws." She eyed the second tube. Odor control. Someone thought of searchers and dogs and tried to cheat both. Zeus sneezed. Reed walked the perimeter with Eleanor while the fire reset crib. She told him about uneasy dreams, a smell she couldn't name. Zeus whining at the same hour, dragging her to the fence when the wind flipped. "You listened," he said. She nodded. "I had to." She glanced toward Clara, who studied tire tracks as if reading a private text. The ambulance doors thudded. Siren rolled out, thinned by the weather. Reed crouched and pressed his forehead to Zeus's skull. "You found him," he murmured. He turned back. Tex flagged footprints, measured stride, and bagged a twig with a faint smear. Rain tried to blur everything, but precision won. Reed spoke for anyone within earshot. "In your darkest moment, what keeps you fighting? Cling to hope, it's stronger than fear." Eleanor exhaled, a laugh. Clara's calm did not ripple. They loaded equipment, collapsed the canopy and left markers where the trench cut the sod. The field looked wounded yet honest, its secret torn open to daylight. Zeus glanced once more at the stump and then at Reed. The cue came with a hand signal. The shepherd rose, shook rain from his coat and fell into step, eyes forward, relentless as the promise that had carried them here and brought a buried heartbeat back to. Wind rose and pressed the attic glass until the screws ticked. Lila crouched beside the open hatch while Noah braced the board against a joist. The stair breathed linseed, varnish, iron, wool, and faint lavender. At the foot, a narrow chamber waited, walls the color of smoke, canvas strips hanging from nails. A table lived beneath the slope, its surface carved by knives used to free dried paint. Under the table, a wooden chest sat as if placed in a hurry. Titan lay at the threshold, breath slow. Lila brushed dust from the lid and lifted the hasp. It resisted, then yielded with a tired click. Inside, a linen-wrapped leather journal. The cover bore no title, only faint rings where a febrilely kissed the surface. She untied the cloth. Rain hammered the roof. Noah stepped closer, saying nothing. Lila opened to the first page. A pencil lighthouse stood in sure lines. Beneath, a date and a single word, stay. Early entries read like studio notes. Light over water at 5:30, wrist aching, try cooler gray. Then sentences widened, no one visited this week. The mailman asked. After my sister, I said she thrives. I wanted to say I miss the niece who drew horizons. Until her pencil snapped. I wanted to say I am lonely. I said none of it. Margaret wrote about mornings before the sun, coffee on a weak burner, walks along the headland, counting waves. She wrote about winter windows turning to mirrors at 4, a grant that lifted a month, the quiet after a sail. She described failing the sea's grammar and painting ropes, gulls and hands when water would not translate. Pages shifted. A storm peeled shingles and sent tar paper across the field like a torn flag. She patched the roof alone, fingers taped, then wrote, I dreamed of a door under the stairs. Behind it I stored words I could not say. Work cannot replace a voice used in time. Another entry confessed, I have sent gifts and never called. I told myself discipline excused distance. That was a myth. I practiced silence until truth learned to live without me. Wind rattled the pane. Titan nudged Lila's boot. She turned a page and found a paragraph that changed the air. I sold my best painting to fund her first year. Breakwater, the blue, I chased for a decade. I told the dealer to route the aid through a scholarship. I feared pride would make her refuse. I left no signature. When she thanked strangers, joy came with grief I had earned. Lila counted backward until the math aligned with the meeting where a loan officer had said possible. Her chest tightened, then loosened. She read on. There were letters never sent, copied as practice for courage. My Lila, if I write I am proud. The sentence feels small. Pride is a poor word. I watched you leave with a suitcase too large and a laugh that filled the hall. I wanted to carry both, and instead carried silence. Forgive the shape of my love. It relied on weather and pictures because I could not master ordinary speech. Noah leaned on the low beam and listened. Thunder rolled and shook the dust. In later entries, Margaret wrote about a gallery closing, a boy who painted boats only to erase them, and the hand that cramped when cold set in. She wrote about age like a tide creeping higher than expected, soaking corners she had believed safe. A bulging page near the center hid a folded letter. Lila eased it free. The heading had no date. My Lila, if this rests in your hands. I failed to say it aloud. I kept paintings, grudges and fears, and none kept me warm. You kept me warm when you were 8 and drew a line that did not end. I wanted to be a shore worth coming back to. I did not know how. I loved you, always. If I die before I say it, let this carry breath where my voice stopped. Lila gave the page to Noah. He took it gently, then opened to an entry of his own choosing. Today, a couple argued kindly about a frame. I wanted to tell them kindness is a frame. Keep it, even when the picture changes. I wanted to tell my niece I am sorry I taught her distance. I am learning late. Forgive a student who needed a long lesson. His voice thinned. He closed the book for a breath, then found another confession. I made a door, because some truths require work to reach. If she climbs those steps, she has already proved more than I could ask. The storm peaked, water drummed. The glass buzzed like a plucked wire. Titan relaxed when Lila stroked his neck. She kept turning pages. She found lists, pigment orders, frame sizes, a framer in town, a shipper upriver, a friend named Alma who stored one crate. She found a sketch of a girl with a long braid. Horizon practice, the caption. She found a receipt for canvas and a note beside it. Spend where the soul returns the change. Near the end, lines grew spare. My hand slows. Light moves faster than I can follow. I dream of calling and waking up holding the phone. If she comes, let the studio help her do brave things I avoided. If she does not, let the household hold its tongue. Work should not beg. Lila pressed the journal to her chest until the leather warmed. When she opened her eyes, Noah was studying beams like a man weighing necessary against right. The list in his pocket felt smaller. He said value lived in more than studs and acreage. He touched the journal and read one more passage. I thought about selling and moving to a city where people talk too much. Then the sea cracked open with light, and I understood the house is not my isolation. Fear. I promised to speak more, even if only to the dog and the waves. The resolve that had arrived with him softened as if rain were working on it. He said they could wait before calling an agent. He wanted to know the studio and the life inside these walls. Lila slid the letter back, closed the cover, and wrapped the linen as if tucking someone in. She set it in the chest, lifted it out again, then kept it in her hands. Thunder moved east. Rain eased to a hiss. Titan breathed, steady as the tide outside. The house breathed in a silence that no longer felt empty. Lila looked around, and saw not a tomb, but a workshop built to protect a life braver on canvas than in speech. Titan thumped his tail once. They climbed to the attic, carried by a calm that felt earned. She told Noah she wanted to stay for a while. Not forever yet, but long enough to understand the gift. He nodded. For the first time since the will arrived, she believed the house could hold more than debt. It could hold a path forward, mapped by paint and the honest ink of wind eased to a wet hush against the attic glass. Lila sat on the floor beside the open chest, the leather journal warm in her hands. She had read Margaret's entries twice, hearing the voice shift from tides and pigments to sentences that trembled with what had gone unsaid. Something in the binding refused to lie flat. She thumbed the spine and felt a ridge beneath the leather. Noah angled the flashlight. Titan set his chin on her knee. "Wait," she said. She eased the cover until a seam appeared where glue had been cut and pressed back. A hollow opened, neat, deliberate, stitched with dark thread. Inside lay an envelope sealed with a fingerprint of ultramarine. Lila broke the paint and slid out 3 things: a letter on thin paper, a gallery receipt clipped to a carbon copy, and a photograph of a painting she had never seen finished. The photograph showed a wave holding light along its back as if the sea had grown a spine. The title beneath it read, "Breakwater." The receipt listed a Rockland gallery, the spring before Lila left for college, and an amount large enough to make her hands shake. A note in tidy script sat beside the figure: per agreement, wire to scholarship fund, donor private. Noah exhaled. "That paid your first year," he said quietly. "Maybe more." "She sold the one she chased for a decade." Lila unfolded the letter. "My Lila, I am writing what I could not say. I worked at Breakwater for 10 years in fragments and failures. I thought I was learning the sea. I was learning to wait, and then I mistook waiting for virtue. When the dealer offered a number, I said yes and asked him to hide my name. I loved that painting like a person, and I traded it for another kind of breathing. If you thanked strangers, know they carried my choice." She paused. Titan's head pressed warmer into her leg, anchoring her to the plank. Thunder rolled farther off toward the headland. She read on. "You may call it cowardice that I did not tell you. Fear and pride wore costumes. I named discipline and privacy. Yet love sat inside them, stubborn as a harbor in weather. I wanted you to be free to accept help without my shadow. I hoped the work would still be mine in your life, even if my name was not." Images rose: library light, cheap coffee at midnight, the bursar's stamp turning fear into motion. Lila had written a thank you to the foundation and drawn a pencil horizon along the bottom. She had pictured a board and a faceless donor, everyone but the woman whose silence had been easy to resent. Guilt arrived quick and cold. She saw the calls she had let ring out, the messages half composed and deleted, the way she had made Margaret into a tidy story, the hermit who chose paint over people. That story cracked like glaze. "I needed her to be simple so I could be right," Lila said. The admission hurt and made space. Noah slid closer, arm over her back. "Steady. You needed a wall when everything else moved," he murmured. "You made the wall out of the quiet person. We do that. Love can hide under the wrong names and still be love." She returned to the page. "I went to the gallery after the sale and stood before the empty space. I expected grief and felt relief. Relief frightened me, because it meant I had chosen correctly. If I had kept Breakwater, it would have gone into the ground with me. Letting it go put wind in a life that needed. I would rather be anonymous in your breath than celebrated in my room." Gratitude braided through sorrow until Lila could not find the seam. Noah studied the transfer code and dates, the ledger of a sacrifice disguised as paperwork. "She planned it so you never had to carry obligation," he said. "That isn't distance, that's design." Rain softened from hammer to whisper. The attic smells: oil, wool, faint lavender grew kind. She reached the letter's last fold. "I wish to paint something that would last longer than fear. It turned out to be you. If this rests in your hands." The door did its work, and so did the dog, and so did the patient sea. "Keep the house if it helps you make, sell it if it keeps you from living. I release you from my ghost. If the boards feel like company, let them. If not, close the door gently and walk toward your life. I love you. I regret the shape of my voice. I hope the work speaks where I failed." Hours ago the house had felt like a tomb. Now it felt like a vessel, wood joined to hold something and move. Tears came. "Steady. She chose me with paint," Lila said, and a small laugh broke through the ache. "I called her cold because it simplified everything. She was trying clumsily to protect the gift." Noah kissed her hairline. "We choose her with time," he said, "and with whatever we make next. Not because we owe, because we recognize what was given." Resolve to sell had softened without dissolving into sentiment. It had changed into a willingness to wait. Titan lifted his head, then set it fully in her lap, a deliberate placing that said stay. She sank a hand into his fur and felt the hum of him steady her more than any sentence could. Lila slid the receipt and photograph into the envelope, then took the photograph back and tucked it in her pocket. She refolded the letter along its original creases and for the first time since the lawyer's call felt the future widen. It did not dictate, it invited. They sat until the storm eased into mist. The attic brightened enough to show scuffed treads, a nicked table where knives had cleaned brushes, rows of jars that had looked like relics and now looked like instruments. Lila closed the chest, then opened it again, and kept the journal out. They lowered the hatch and climbed down, hands on the thin rail polished by years of work. The hallway smelled less like neglect and more like salt warmed by light. Floorboards no longer answered each step with complaint, they offered their small creak as a greeting. At the landing window the sea had turned pewter-edged and pale, the widow's walk looked upright. Lila pressed her forehead to the cool glass and let the chill mark her like a vow. "Thank you," she whispered to Margaret, to Noah, to Titan, to the house that had held its secret until she was ready to hear it. She imagined breakwater in a room somewhere, a stranger pausing before it, and feeling braver briefly than before. That thought would have pleased Margaret more than any praise. They moved toward the stairs hand in hand, Titan's nails ticking beside them. Outside the last shreds of weather slid east. Inside the choice to honor rather than punish felt like a door that once opened would not shut. The house listened, then settled, relieved to have been understood at last. Morning arrived rinsed and forgiving, a silvery light smoothing the harbor until the water looked ironed flat. Softly, the house breathed easier beneath it. Salt lifted from the clapboard and the widow's walk stood straighter than it had the night before. Lila and Noah drank coffee on the porch steps with Titan draped across their boots like a warm sash. No alarms, no hurried exit, only the practical quiet that follows a decision made. They agreed without ceremony, no listing. They would remain, repair what weather had gnawed, and turn the front rooms into a gallery that carried Margaret's voice forward. The studio would stay intact, the journal returning to its chest each night like a careful heart. They would sleep upstairs, cook in the least broken corner of the kitchen, and measure every task against the line Margaret left. Work with the grain of the life you have. Repairs began where storms speak first. Noah strapped into a harness and climbed with shingles, nails and copper flashing clipped to his belt. Pete from the hardware store belayed from the lawn, teaching knots and laughing when Noah swore at a stubborn ridge cap. Inside, windows opened for the first time in years. The house exhaled cold, then drew in briny air until stale notes thinned. Lila pulled muslin off sofas, scrubbed trim, and found the real color beneath smoke. The dining room wanted a rail that let frames hang true without poking plaster. The study needed nothing but light and respect. She washed until rags turned black and then went clean again. A small, stubborn ritual that felt like prayer. Electricians arrived with patient hands. Noah shadowed them from outlet to outlet, watching brittle cloth wire give way to neat runs and labeled breakers. A new panel settled on the wall like a calm teacher. When test lamps glowed steady, Lila laughed, and the sound rang off plaster like a bell returning to duty. They celebrated with chowder from Alma's cafe and a page from the journal read aloud at the work table. Never let walls glare, ask them to listen. The floor obeyed. Grain rose under the drum sander in pale curls that smelled like warm bread. They sealed boards with a matte finish that honored age without fossilizing it. Lila tested paint swatches throughout the day and chose a white that held warmth at dusk, yet stayed clear at noon. Word traveled faster than plans. Pete returned with a step stool and a bag of donuts. Alma brought thermoses and a story about the night she held a door while Margaret carried a wet canvas through sideways rain. She came here, ordered pie and drew without making a fuss, he said. Titan greeted visitors with courthouse dignity. Children asked to pet him. He accepted gravely, then resumed his post by the attic stair as if guarding an oath. Afternoons belonged to work, evenings began to belong to making. Lila set an easel in the back room that faced gray water and stretched a modest canvas. She pulled the photograph of breakwater from her pocket, not to copy but to ask questions. She sketched a horizon line and let it run long, the way she had as a child. Noah leaned on the doorjamb and watched her shoulders find a pace that matched the sea. They ended nights with soup, tea and a paragraph from the journal. On the third evening Lila said, 3 weeks and surprised herself, a small opening. Studies the journal under glass, and one new piece. Noah nodded, circled a date on the calendar, and booked an inspector for peace of mind. A north breeze cleaned the headland. Laundry snapped on the line like miniature sails. Noah planned cedar and lettered a sign in his neat print, Carter Reed Gal. Lila brushed gold leaf on the ampersand because a modest flourish suited the promise. Curation made her understand her aunt in a way grief had not. She paired a wrist study with a photograph of Margaret's knife-scarred table, letting practice echo practice. One wall stayed empty for her painting, which she worked at dawn in thin layers, refusing heroics, accepting steady revelation. She did not chase a famous wave, she painted weather meeting stone and the honest seam between. Noah found a community he had lacked in Boston without noticing the moment it began. He joined a crew repairing the pier, borrowed a long level, taught 2 teenagers how to square a frame, and swapped labor for advice on heating old houses without breaking them. At the church board he pinned a notice opening soon, bring a memory of Margaret if you have one. People like to see craft defended, she said, handing him a list of titles and a key to the meeting room. On the eve of the opening, they strung warm lights, set folding chairs and swept sawdust from corners that kept inventing more of it. The house had straightened inside and out. Lila tucked it above the hatch seam, visible if you knew, invisible otherwise, perfectly. If you have ever tried to honor a quiet love, you know the difference between display and devotion. Ask yourself what act allows that love to keep working in the world, and follow the answer that expands your breath. Opening day matched their hope. A woman traced light with her finger in the air, careful not to touch. Lila kept speeches short, told one true story about a letter hidden in a journal, and thanked the town for bringing its weather inside. Noah handled sales with unhurried care and showed buyers how to hang work away from direct sunlight. Titan lay at the stairs and watched each guest pass with the composed patience of a sentinel who understands ceremony. When Alma pressed a folded receipt into Lila's hand and whispered, "Keep going," Lila felt her throat tighten, and managed only a nod. By afternoon the gallery held that soft murmur of many small conversations, the sound makers recognized as proof that their work is being met half. After the last guest left, they stood on the porch and listened to water knock at pilings. Stars gathered like salt above the harbor. Lila set her palm on the newel post and felt the grain, the joinery, the honest pride of wood that had waited for such a night. Titan leaned against her leg and looked up for orders. "Stay," she said, and meant it broadly. "Stay here, stay patient, stay making." Noah wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and the house, relieved of its secret, settled like a chest filled with new breath. They went inside together. The studio kept its hush. The chest waited, the journal safe. Lila touched the easel and saw the day's underpainting drying toward something she would recognize when morning returned. She whispered, "We'll keep it working," to the air and to the woman who had traded her best wave for a future, and to the dog who had insisted on the door, and to the partner who had learned the house's language alongside her. Outside the harbor breathed. Inside the gallery answered. Hope did not shout, it endured, patient and bright, a steady light on a newly named shore. Spring settled on the headland the way sunlight settles over a page when a reader finally reaches the line that explains everything. Grass brightened along the stone walk. Lilacs lifted soft color by the porch rail, and gulls wrote lazy arcs above the harbor while the tide murmured at the pilings. The mansion no longer seemed stranded. Fresh paint gleamed without vanity. Windows opened easily, and the widow's walk stood square as if relieved by honest work. Inside, the gallery breathed like an instrument tuned at last. Margaret's studies of hands, ropes, and winter skies shared space with finished canvases that carried weather without growing heavy. A small card near the door told visitors what the house had held and why it now opened, not as a shrine but as a working room where a life continues to speak. Lila read the card once and put it away. The pictures knew how to hold themselves. Noah greeted early guests, poured coffee from a dented thermos, and pointed out the seam of old maple running across the floor like a river that refused to dry. Some mornings, school children arrived with notebooks, pencils, and restless questions. She guided them to the window facing the harbor, asked them to draw the line where water meets rock, and waited while silence gathered into concentration. Titan lay near the attic stairs, paws crossed, ears relaxed. watching with a patience that steadied the room. He still checked the hatch each night, then returned to his rug satisfied that the secret had become a story and the story had become shared air. Lila painted at dawn before the gallery opened, building layers slowly, letting thin color rise like breath. She resisted drama and trusted exactness. A new canvas leaned on the easel, now almost finished, the scene where sea kisses granite in bright weather after storm. It held no grand wave, only commitment, the beauty of staying. Noah sanded a railing, rehung a stubborn door, replaced a cracked pane, and laughed with Pete when a hinge squealed triumphantly at the first smooth swing. On the corkboard he pinned thank you notes and stories people left about Margaret, a pie delivered to the cafe on a night everyone looked worried, a sketch mailed to a stranger who had lost a job, a set of brushes given to a kid who could not afford supplies. The town that once saw a quiet woman walking through rain with a wrapped frame now saw context, tenderness, and design. Spring coaxed neighbors into slower conversations. A lobsterman in a red cap pointed at Breakwater's photograph and said he knew that exact light because he had chased traps under it for 30 years. A teenager asked whether love can live under silence without dying. Lila answered yes, then added that love grows stronger when it learns to speak. She said the learning can take years and still be worth the wait. She did not dramatize regret. She named it gently, then turned the talk toward what to build now. Noah watched from the doorway the way he had done the first week, and felt certainty settle like a weight in a pocket. They had chosen correctly. They would keep choosing again tomorrow. Afternoons carried bright air and easy footsteps. Visitors moved from frame to frame, lingering at the desk where the leather journal rested under glass, reading a single page printed beside it. Spend where the soul returns the change. Some wiped their eyes, some smiled. A boy tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered that he wanted to paint boats and erase them until the feeling matched the weather in his chest. She nodded, bought him a small set, and promised to find paper. The sun warmed the porch. Flags along the street stirred. From the Widow's Walk the view ran clear to the far lighthouse and back again without interruption. Evenings, after the bell at the church counted daylight's last inches, Lila and Noah closed the door, swept, flipped switches, and sat on the steps with Titan leaning against their leg. They spoke in low voices about small repairs, next month's workshop, and the letter Margaret might have written if time had not winnowed her courage too soon. They thanked the dog aloud. They thanked the stubborn ring in the attic, the cold stare, the linen-wrapped journal, the envelope sealed with ultramarine, the receipt that turned suspicion into gratitude, and the town that had adopted a gallery with practical kindness. They did not say destiny. They said work, love, and second chances. On a bright Saturday a family arrived from away. The father photographed the floor's maple seam, the mother studied a study of hands. The daughter stood before the new painting and stood longer than she expected. When she turned, she asked Lila how a person knows when a door deserves opening. Lila said a good door asks quietly at first and keeps asking with patience. If you feel braver after touching the wood, open it. If the hinge complains, add oil. If your hands shake, ask a friend to stand nearby while you lift. The girl nodded, swallowed, and reached for her mother's arm. Outside, the magnolia by the fence released a slow drift of petals bright as folded paper boats. Later that week, the town held a small gathering to welcome the season. Tables lined the green. Kids chalked anchors on the pavement. A fiddler played a tune that made ankles feel nimble, and the cafe served chowder until pots gleamed bare. Noah helped rig tents when the wind teased the canvas, then told the librarian he would repair a shelf. Lila donated giclées to a raffle for the school art fund. Pete announced that the gallery had already paid 3 months of bills with sales, then pretended to be offended when everyone clapped. People laughed like an orchestra tuning to the same note. In that hum, Lila felt her aunt's absence and presence at once, and for the first time the combined weight did not bow her. It lifted. Night washed the town in quiet silver. Back home, the couple climbed to the studio. Lila signed her new piece with a steady hand, then rested the brush and listened to boards settle, pipes sigh, and a dog breathe slow. She thought about the long chain of choices that had moved them from grief into making, from doubt into generosity. Noah reached for her hand. They stood together a while and let calm root itself without apology. Below, the gallery waited for tomorrow. Above, stars threaded the dark with unhurried light. Before they slept, Lila opened the door, walked onto the porch and looked toward the harbor land. She spoke softly to anyone who needed to hear what the house had taught. If you inherited silence, you are allowed to answer with creation. If you received love disguised as distance, you are allowed to unwrap it without bitterness. If a dog pulls you toward a seam in the floor, follow. If fog lifts, let it lift. Honor can be humble and still magnificent. Standing there with Noah's arm around her and Titan leaning warm against her calf, she asked one last thing of the night and of the people far away who had listened to every wave, bored and breath. Carry this forward. Let your home, your shop, your studio, your desk, your kitchen table become a place where hidden kindness turns into visible practice. Tell us about the morning you realized a gift had been waiting inside a quiet gesture. Tell us about the afternoon when an old hurt softened because truth arrived with gentleness rather than noise. Tell us where you are watching from, the city that holds you, the country that shapes your weather, and the names of those who taught you courage by giving without applause. Then help us keep this room open. Subscribe if this journey speaks to you. Share this story with someone who needs an unlocked door. Your voice matters here. Leave your memory below so others can find their own seam of light. If Titan's loyalty uncovered a truth for Lila and Noah, what hidden love waits in your story? Subscribe and share below to join our journey.